So let's go down the parasitic rabbit hole for a bit. So I'm going to make some propositions, and you tell me if you believe that they're valid. The first ground truth, I would say, is that I've read an array of evolutionary literature. This isn't the only hypothesis, but it's a good one, that sex itself emerged so that creatures who were replicating could escape the problem of parasites. So the theory goes is that the parasitic form is simpler than the form of the host, generally speaking, and that can give it a reproductive speed advantage. And so the parasite can overwhelm the host, and the host perishes ignominiously with no offspring under those circumstances. So what the host does is mix up its genes so that the parasite is stymied in its attempt to adapt to the host across generations. And the parasite problem is so deep that the host is willing to sacrifice 50% of its genes, of its variable genes, which is what happens in sex, rather than, say, parthenogenic reproduction, where you just clone yourself. So that's how deep the parasite problem is. So is that reasonable so far?
Yeah, it is. And I'm trying to think whether the theory that you just enunciated, if it's not Bill Hamilton who came up with it.
It might be Hamilton, right? Yeah. I think it might be Hamilton.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me add one.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I just want to add one more layer, because this will tie it into your book and into the experiences that we've had. So, this is a weird way of introducing this, but I'm going to do it anyways. I spend a lot of time showing my students at the University of Toronto and Harvard the movie Pinocchio, because Pinocchio is a deadly accurate representation of development and its perils. It's really remarkable. But there's weird things about it, very weird things that are hard to explain. The fact of the bug that's the conscience, the fact that Pinocchio starts as a marionette, pulled by forces that are beyond his control, right? You know what he's tempted by? It's so funny, Gad. He's tempted to become an actor, so that's a narcissist. He's tempted to become a liar, so someone who falsifies. And he's tempted to use his hypothetical illness and victimization as a ticket to the land of the delinquents and the death of society. That's the way the narrative lays itself out. In any case, this is the odd part that's relevant to the parasite issue. There's a scene in the movie where Pinocchio rescues Geppetto from the belly of a whale. And everyone swallows that, so to speak, as perfectly understandable, even though it makes no sense whatsoever. So I've been thinking about this because I couldn't crack that. I've been thinking about it for like 30 years. What the hell is that? What does that signify? And why does it sit well with an audience, given its perplexing and absurd nature? Well, okay. So a carcass is a storehouse of value, right? So that's why we were herders, obviously, or hunters. And if we hunted mammoths way back 25,000 years ago, we would take down a carcass that was too big for us to consume, and we would store it in the bodies of our co-hunters. And that was reputation, right? Right. Our reputation as an avid sharer made it more likely that we would live through periods of famine because we're collective hunters. Okay, so that's how a carcass might be distributed and transformed into reputation. In any case, the largest of all possible carcasses is a whale carcass. So a whale carcass is a storehouse of value. When the spirit that gave rise to the provisioning of the carcass dies, the dying father is inside the whale, and that's why the puppet who's trying to transform has to rescue it. That's the university's Gad. So this is what's happened as far as I'm concerned. Tell me what you think of this. Since World War II, particularly, we set up a very conscientious society. It was based almost entirely on merit, absent corruption from, say, oh God, I don't know when, but certainly from 1945 to, say, 2010, 2005, something like that. And in consequence, we stacked up an awful lot of whale carcasses. And the parasites moved in.
Yeah, I mean, I liked sort of the metaphor, the explanation of how using the sharing mechanism, because I can't consume, that is literally out of reciprocal altruism, right? It's
right.
It's Bob
That's
Trivers.
Yep.
Exactly. And actually, I was wondering, because earlier we were talking about your time at Harvard. Trivers got his PhD at Harvard, and E.O. Wilson, who was also at Harvard and recently passed away, I recently read his autobiography, Naturalist, which I highly recommend for anyone.
Oh, yeah.
It's beautifully written, really gorgeous autobiography. E.O. Wilson used to say that when, and you know, E.O. Wilson was no intellectual slouch, right? I mean, he was a very bright guy. And he used to say that when Bob Trivers would walk into his office in his sort of manic phase, discussing all kinds of brilliant ideas, he would be so exhausted after that meeting that the day was over, he had done enough, and he would just go home. That gives you a sense of the kind of brilliance that you might find in some of these carcasses of whales that we call universities today. And I only wish, I long for the day that we can go back to, you know, those kinds of institutions rather than my having to indigenize evolutionary psychology.
Right, right. Well, that's a good place to close. Well, we could imagine this, Gad, then. So here's two types of value. There's the value of what's being stored. So that's the carcass. That would be the Harvard endowment. That would be the brand value of the Ivy Leagues or the brand value of a PhD. All of those are carcasses. And so they can be stripped to the bone by the parasites who care nothing for the future propagation of that enterprise. They're just going to take everything and run. And the cowardly professors have turned a willfully blind eye to the invasion of the parasites, the grievance studies, the resentful mob who deprioritized the merit that built the institutions. Okay, so the carcass is one place of value. The other place of value that's deeper is the spirit of the enterprise that gave rise to the storehouse of value, right? And the universities are also attacking that. They're parasitizing the brand and they're destroying the principle upon which it was founded, which was pure. It was basically intellectual capability and conscientiousness. You know, we studied scientists to find out what predicted long-term research productivity. And we thought maybe it would be, we knew IQ would matter because it matters about everything that's complex. Openness, which is creativity, didn't predict at all, not above IQ. In fact, there was a slight negative prediction, but conscientiousness was a walloping predictor. Now, you know, openness and IQ are positively correlated. So if you're smarter, you tend to be more creative. But above and beyond intelligence, openness didn't matter. And I think that's reasonable because most diligent science isn't done by radical geniuses, right? There's some who are revolutionary in this open manner, but most of the incremental science, I think the reason science is so powerful is because you can turn it into something that conscientious people can do, right? Just by diligent pursuit.
Although I think the biggest thinkers are those who have a bent towards being generalists, because the biggest breakthroughs in science happen at the intersections of disciplines,
that's right.
Right? While it is true that the hyper specialist is the one who does the important incremental work, the really big ideas, and this goes back to, I think we maybe discussed this in the past, or maybe we didn't. I mentioned earlier E.O. Wilson. So E.O. Wilson wrote in the late 1990s one of my favorite books of all time. The book was titled Consilience, right?
Consilience, yeah.
Unity
It's
of
a great
knowledge,
book.
right? And I think both of us, you and I, in our own distinct ways, are really consilient thinkers. When you're doing your relationship between biblical narratives and linking it to contemporary realities or to psychological realities, you're engaging in an endeavor of consilience. You're building bridges between ancient stories and current truths. You're building a link between science and religion. And so you are being consilient. In my own work, I have published in many, many different disciplines, which people told me not to do because they thought that that's the exact way to not build an successful academic career. But I didn't care because I was intellectually curious. I want to go where I want to go. And so I think that while it's all great for people to be incrementalists and hyper specialists, I think the truly big guys, the ones who really stand the test of time, are the big consilient thinkers.
Yeah, well, that adds that additional element of exploration and revolutionary explanation. That's a good time, I think, Gad, to bring this portion of the enterprise to a close.